These are the forgotten origins of witchcraft in cinema, and the story begins not with special effects or Hollywood magic, but with centuries of very real persecution, death, and terror. What we see on screen today traces back through a lineage of genuine historical horror that claimed between 40,000 and 60,000 lives across Europe and colonial America, long before the first witch appeared on film. In 1906, the archetype had been carved into human consciousness through blood and fire. The cinematic witch didn't emerge from imagination. She was born from documented history, court records, and the testimonies of those who lived through one of humanity's darkest chapters. To understand how witches became a staple of horror cinema, we need to journey back to their ancient origins, when magic isn't feared, but revered. In the civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, practitioners of magic held respected positions in society. They were healers, advisors, and spiritual guides whose wisdom complemented religious life rather than threatening it. The ancient Mesopotamians had specific terms for magical practitioners, the male kaššāpu and female kaššāptu. While they recognized the potential for destructive magic motivated by malice, magic itself wasn't inherently evil. In Homer's Odyssey, written around 800 BC, we encounter Circe, perhaps literature's most famous early witch, who transforms men into animals. Yet even she operates within a world where magic is simply another facet of divine power. The ancient Greeks worshipped Hecate, the goddess of witches, hexes, poisonous plants, and sorcery. One of her names, Chthoniya, literally means of the underworld, establishing an early connection between witchcraft and the realm of the dead. The biblical account of the Witch of Endor, written between 931 BC and 721 BC, shows King Saul seeking her help to commune with the dead prophet Samuel. These weren't stories of evil, they were accounts of spiritual practice. Everything changed with the rise of Christianity. As the new religion spread across Europe, polytheistic traditions that had embraced magic for millennia were suddenly branded as paganism. What had once been complementary to faith became heretical. The medieval Catholic Church began viewing witchcraft as maleficium, a dangerous blend of black magic and apostasy involving pacts with the devil. This shift in perception set the stage for one of history's most sustained periods of persecution. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, officially authorizing the prosecution of witches. 2 years later, Heinrich Kramer published the Malleus Maleficarum, also called Hammer of Witches, a manual that would guide witch hunters for centuries. The Malleus Maleficarum was a comprehensive guide to identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. Kramer presented it as official Catholic doctrine, though the Church itself condemned the book for recommending illegal procedures and contradicting established demonology. One modern scholar called it a rival to Mein Kampf, as one of the most infamous and despised of books. Yet its influence was undeniable, spreading throughout Europe and providing the intellectual framework for mass persecution. From approximately 1400 to 1775, about 100,000 people were prosecuted for witchcraft in Europe and British America. Between 40,000 and 60,000 were executed, almost all in Europe. The peak period ran from 1560 to 1630, when witch hunting fever reached its height. In Germany alone, 16,474 people faced trial for witchcraft, with close to 7,000 put to death. The demographics of persecution reveal a disturbing pattern. Across Europe, roughly 80% of those accused were women, though this varied significantly by region. In Iceland, 92% of the accused were men, while Estonia targeted 60% men, and Moscow saw 2/3 male accusations. But the overall trend was clear. Witchcraft accusations disproportionately targeted women, often elderly widows, or those who did not conform to social expectations. The persecution wasn't limited to Europe. In colonial Massachusetts, the Salem witch trials of from 1692 to 1693, became the deadliest witch hunt in North American history. More than 200 people were accused of practicing the devil's magic. 20 were executed. 19 hanged on Gallows Hill, and one, 71-year-old Giles Corey, pressed to death with heavy stones after refusing to submit to trial. At least 5 more died in jail awaiting trial. The Salem trials began in January 1692, when 2 young girls, 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, began exhibiting strange behavior. The first 3 women accused were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, an enslaved woman who became the first to confess. Bridget Bishop was executed on June 10, 1692, becoming the trial's first victim. The hysteria continued until Governor William Phips disbanded the Court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692, finally ending the nightmare. These historical events provided the foundation for cinema's fascination with witchcraft. When Georges Méliès created The Witch in 1906, he wasn't inventing a new monster, he was adapting centuries of cultural memory. His film, inspired by Breton folklore and commissioned by the Grands Magasins du Fayel department store for children to watch while their parents shopped, introduced cinema audiences to a figure they already knew from history books and family stories. But Benjamin Christensen's 1922 masterpiece Häxan, Witchcraft Through the Ages, truly established the cinematic witch as a complex figure worthy of serious examination. After finding a copy of the Malleus Maleficarum in a Berlin bookshop, Christensen spent 2 years researching manuals, illustrations, and treatises on witches and witch hunting. He included a lengthy bibliography in the original playbill, treating his subject with scholarly rigor. Häxan was revolutionary in multiple ways, costing between 1.5 million and 2 million Swedish kroner. It became the most expensive Scandinavian silent film in history. Christensen himself played the devil, which meant that when young women lined up to kiss the devil's posterior in the film, they were kissing the director's own backside. For the spectacular flying sequences, his technicians constructed an enormous model town on a giant carousel holding more than 250 houses, each about 6 feet high. The carousel was turned by 20 men, while more than 75 witches were filmed separately by a moving camera. The film's first chapter pioneered a documentary style that wouldn't become popular until decades later, perhaps making Häxan one of the first true documentaries. Yet upon release, critics were divided. Variety called it unadulterated horror and declared it absolutely unfit for public exhibition. However, Peter Cowie later argued in 80 Years of Cinema that Häxan established Christensen as an auteur of uncommon imagination and with a pictorial flair far ahead of his time. Academic Chloe Germain Buckley identified Häxan's quasi-feminist interpretation, noting how Christensen focuses on the history of witchcraft in order to show the way that the oppression of women takes on different guises in different historical periods. Using emerging psychoanalytic theory, Christensen suggested links between contemporary diagnoses of hysteria and the European witch hunts, arguing that society's treatment of non-conforming women had evolved, but not necessarily improved. This sophisticated approach to witchcraft in cinema reached a new peak with Robert Eggers' 2015 film, The Witch. Eggers conducted exhaustive research, stating in the end credits that the film was inspired by many folk tales, fairy tales, and written accounts of historical witchcraft, including journals, diaries, and court records. Much of the dialogue comes directly from these period sources. To achieve authenticity, Eggers shot only with natural light, using candles for indoor scenes. He stylized the title as the V Witch, with 2 V's instead of a W, finding this spelling in a Jacobean-era pamphlet on witchcraft. The film's Coven of Witches was performed by a troupe of Butoh dancers who created their own choreography. Even the goat broke actor Ralph Ineson's ribs during filming, adding an element of genuine danger to the production. The Witch premiered at Sundance Film Festival on January 27, 2015, and received wide release on February 19, 2016. It achieved both critical and financial success, grossing $40 million against a $4 million budget. On Rotten Tomatoes, it maintains a 91% approval rating based on 337 reviews, with a Metacritic score of 84 out of 100. The film has since been cited as influencing the folk horror genre and is considered one of the best horror films of the 21st century. The continued fascination with witchcraft in cinema reflects our ongoing struggle to understand historical persecution. Recent films, like Elizabeth Sankey's 2024 documentary Witches, continue exploring these themes, connecting historical accusations of witchcraft with contemporary women's mental health issues. Sankey's film won Best Independent Documentary at the 2024 British Independent Film Awards, showing that audiences remain hungry for serious examination of these historical parallels. Yet debates persist about the true scope of witch persecution. On the wilder shores of the feminist and witch cult movements, as historian Robin Briggs notes, a potent myth has become established, to the effect that 9 million women were burned as witches in Europe. This figure represents an overestimate by a factor of up to 200, highlighting how historical trauma can become exaggerated over time. The reality is horrifying enough without exaggeration. Between 40,000 and 60,000 documented executions represent individual human tragedies, people accused of impossible crimes, tortured into confessions, and killed for beliefs that threatened religious or social order. Each execution was someone's mother, daughter, sister, or friend, destroyed by a system that criminalized difference and nonconformity. Cinema's treatment of witchcraft has evolved from simple entertainment to sophisticated historical evolution. Early films like Malleus The Witch presented witches as fairy tale figures. Christensen's Häxan elevated them to subjects worthy of scholarly analysis. Modern films like The Witch treat historical witchcraft with anthropological precision, showing not just what people believed, but why they believed it. This evolution reflects our growing understanding of how persecution operates. The witch trials weren't aberrations but systematic campaigns targeting specific populations during times of social stress. Understanding this history helps us recognize similar patterns in contemporary society, where marginalized groups still face accusations and persecution based on fear rather than evidence. From ancient Mesopotamian magical practitioners to modern horror cinema, the figure of the witch has served as a mirror reflecting society's fears, prejudices, and need for scapegoats. Cinema has transformed her from a figure of terror into one of complex tragedy, showing not just the supernatural fears that haunted our ancestors, but the very human capacity for cruelty that turned neighbors against neighbors and communities against their most vulnerable members. The witch's journey from historical reality to cinematic icon reminds us that our entertainment often carries the weight of genuine human suffering. Every film witch, whether comedic or terrifying, traces her lineage back to real people who died for crimes they couldn't have committed. In understanding this history, we honor their memory while learning to recognize the forces that created one of humanity's darkest chapters. Forces that remain relevant as long as societies search for someone to blame when the world becomes too frightening to understand.